I'm really pleased that Nick Thompson and Vinny, I should have asked you how to pronounce your last name before we started. I'm sorry?
Putting you on the spot. It's Poliseno.
Policy. I would have gotten it right. That's amazing. Vinny Poliseno, thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking today about things that are deal desk and contracts related, key metrics and signals to close deals faster in H2. I would love for you all to tell us a little bit about why you are experts in this space and what you're doing today. And Nick, let's start with you. And no relation, by the way. We spell our last names the same way, but no relation.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of my experience, I've been doing deal desk now for close to 7 years, hard to believe, across 3 different companies. I worked for close to 4 years at a company called App Dynamics, where I started my deal desk career really in order operations and progressed up into deal desk leadership. And then I went to a company called Data Robot for 18 months and was the chief of staff for the chief legal officer at Data Robot. And then in both of those situations, we were Ironclad users when it came to our contracting and using it as a contract lifecycle management tool. I made the transition to join Ironclad. September 15th will be my 2-year anniversary. And I was the first deal desk hire here. And I'm really focused on building out the function.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Vinny, tell us a little bit about your background.
For sure. So my name is Vinny Poliseno. I'm one of the co-founders here at Scale Matters. I have about 15 years this overall in the RevOps community, sales cloud sort of scenario. Gone through the thick and thin, was one of those sort of folks that started off in marketing, and previous person that was doing Salesforce quit and they said, who wants to do it? And I raised my hand, and next 15 years goes by and here we are.
Oh my gosh, that's relatable. So I'm Kamala Thompson. I'm listed as the head of marketing here, but I also have 15 years of operation experience spanning marketing, sales, and customer success ops. I too just happened to be good at CRM, and then there I went. I have also helped build Deal Desk at multiple companies. So we are going to be focused pretty heavily on contracts and contract metrics. So what I would really like to talk about, and we'll start with you, Nick, what are key contract metrics, and maybe how do you think about how we should be measured on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, I think we've got a couple of slides in the deck around this, but in terms of like key metrics that I care about as a deal desk leader, as a RevOps leader, is I want to understand how does our typical sales cycle unfold. Where is deal desk being engaged versus where is a deal kind of working its way through the pipeline from start to finish without deal desk, without RevOps, finance, pricing, where all of those cross-functional teams, how do we create a process that is as seamless as possible, that allows for increased deal flow and velocity? And we here at Ironclad use a lot of our contracts and contract metrics in order to really tell that story and understand where we're being engaged, how we can potentially adjust our operating model to allow for a really seamless transaction experience, not only for our internal sales team, but for our counterparties, prospects, and customers who are negotiating with us.
And then, Vinny, any hot takes or insights on these 3 points before we get into the more detailed slides?
For sure. Just to echo what Nick said, right? You want to think about your people and your processes. Obviously, you need to collect so much data that can be actionable, but at the same point, you got to make it not so hard on your person who's the one who's doing it. Take a moment back as you are thinking through your design process and what you are laying out. Walk a mile in their shoes. If you're asking a rep to fill in 15 different fields before they can move to another thing, how can you make that a little bit more automated or guided so that way it doesn't feel daunting to them to go from A to B to C?
And it's interesting because a lot of times I come at it from the standpoint of managing a team of deal desk individuals. And I want to get pretty, detailed around both who's handling the deal and coaching the salesperson through different iterations of coding and contracting. And then looking at the salesperson too, because I really want to identify opportunities for coaching. It takes a special personality. Nick, you must be a very patient person to have stuck with deal desks so long. Very even keeled. I can tell you're even keeled. I just now I know you're also patient.
Yeah, I enjoy it, to your point. Yeah. It's a very, I think, unique skill set. One that takes patience, but it also takes, I think, a commitment to being data driven, a commitment to process building. And I enjoy the feeling of being the kind of central spoke in our RevOps function. Everything from the time that a quote starts to be built to post signatures. Let's look back on this contract that we executed 2-3 years ago because the customer's coming up for renewal. I think being committed to every part of that process and that life cycle is obviously imperative to being successful in the role.
And it's a lot of understanding too about the mechanics and details, especially for renewals and expansions, and being able to have that historical outlook. I've already shared with them many times my trauma of losing. I didn't lose the contract, but somebody lost a contract. We'll get into that more later. It's a very embarrassing conversation to have with your customer. Okay, so let's talk through why contract data is important, but let's start with what are the kinds of things we're tracking about a contract and why does it matter to deal execution?
Yeah, absolutely. From my perspective, it's something that we talk about as a company a lot. Ironclad was founded on the ideal and the philosophy that contracts are the backbone of every business, the foundation of every agreement that we have with our customers. So you mentioned a couple different types. It really doesn't matter if it's an NDA, which is early in the process, versus an order form or a master services agreement, a statement of work. I think we all have different terminology for them, but I think the importance of contracts is twofold. One, it helps to tell the story and the relationship between two parties, but more importantly, like the data in the contract itself, as an operator and as someone who shapes a lot of our processes and how we conduct our business, I rely on contract data significantly to help me understand, as our company grows and scales, what are the types of obligations that we have to deliver to our customers? What are the most frequent commercial aspects and terms that are frequently included? And like I said, how can we speed up some of these common reoccurring, I would say, very operational topics, so that ultimately teams like Deal Desk can become a little bit more of a strategic function, kind of called out in the middle pillar there.
I really like your point because there's such a huge opportunity for Deal Desk to flag things that are consistently either altered or added to contracts. How popular is proof of concept to net payment terms? We're only allowing 30 when everybody's asking for 60 and 90. And what kind of approvals do we need for each of these things? And it's a great way to reduce friction in the deal. Vinny, I saw you nodding. Do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, and as you're starting to use these third-party tools like Ironclad here, they help you as the administrator that is building out this process and working with your team to make sure that you are staying front and center on these kind of things. Or do you have a Salesforce CPQ on top that allows us to run a report on how many terms have been modified and what sort of red lines it needs to go through? And to your point, is there a person that always does this? Is there an industry that always does this? Or is there just all over the board? So it's trying to figure out those decisions based off of the data that's coming through. So if you capture it, that's great.
And I would highly recommend tracking from a few different directions. So one, we mentioned the legal terms and conditions. There's also a really big opportunity to track discounting. And like I said, I like to get granular because some reps, if they're not close to their number, they get a little desperate and we start discounting much deeper. Maybe there's a coaching opportunity there. Maybe we're starting at the wrong price point. Also, how we're discounting and what we're discounting is super critical. So for example, services are probably going to have less profit margin because people and resources are expensive than a software line item. So really thinking through how the team is coming to the table with those discounts, what's most likely to be approved, and then proactively coaching some of those sales reps on how they can think about the deal. So thinking about helping accelerate deal cycles, looking at time of submission to time of approval, what are some other metrics that you think about when it comes to tracking the deal cycle and velocity?
I myself, I think I look a lot at what is the rate of an approval. Vinny, you referenced Salesforce CPQ. We use that for all of our pricing and discounting approvals. one of the first things I did when I stepped into my role was just understand what are separating the process and the policy. And on the policy side, understanding like what are the thresholds that we care about from a discounting perspective. And systems like Salesforce CPQ are great in the sense of I was able to generate a report quickly. They told me, hey, you have this approval set up and it's gotten approved 100% of the time, which is a red flag to me as someone who's largely accountable for the process, because that's time that we're spent waiting, chasing someone on an approval, and the data, taking kind of a data-driven approach to say, it's being approved 100% of the time. If that is the case, let's tell the story behind that. Is it because we're structuring every deal perfectly, or is it just because we have a kind of a needless approval, honestly, where it's creating bottlenecks? Understanding, I think, the why behind why there's certain approvals and the metrics behind those underlying approvals has allowed us to really accelerate our deal cycles and set up approvals that are really, I would say, consequential to the business. Like my philosophy is that if we have an approval that is always being approved, then we need to be very introspective about, do we really need it? Because it's probably something that is really just a check the box exercise, let's say.
And Nick, you got to imagine too, right? That's just adding an extra step in the deal flow itself, right? If a rep needs to slow down the momentum of this and say, oh, I need to get this checkbox checked to keep going. To your point, right? Is it necessary just because we're checking the box?
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up a great point around maybe team-specific data or segment-specific data. Understanding that an enterprise deal is not going to be the same from a pricing perspective, most likely, or versus a mid-market deal. And understanding the trends within maybe specific segments of the business has allowed us to set up segment-specific approvals so that we understand if potentially, like we don't treat our sales org, let's say, as the same across every segment. You can cater specific approvals for, deal size, maybe customer size, number of employees, all of those types of things.
I would also really highly recommend that people on deal desks speak up when they see patterns and don't assume that the people doing the approvals are clocking how frequently things are happening, because all of us are super busy. There's recency bias. We're going to make some assumptions. If you have the data really well summarized and you notice, hey, we're consistently trending up week over week on the types of discount approvals we're seeing, the discounts are going up, we could be, I don't know, spotting a market trend. Because a lot of us in Deal Desk, we started noticing contract changes before there was officially a recession. So it's a great opportunity to come across as a strategic partner. So let's talk about some of the metrics that you called out here. Nick, let's start with you on the no touch versus negotiated and how the frequency is actually coming through Deal Desk. Why and how do you all track that?
Yeah, I think perhaps like the number one struggle I've had as a Deal Desk leader, operator, like regardless of level within the organization, is you have a really hectic quarter end, you have a really hectic month end, you're negotiating tons. And when things like that transpire over, let's say, like email, you come in on the first day of the next quarter and you're exhausted and you've had hopefully a successful quarter end. You've closed a lot of deals, but like an operating model like that really makes it difficult to tell the story using data to say, hey, here's the deals the Deal Desk worked on versus, and here's where we contributed driving maybe a higher close rate. Here's deals that maybe we worked on that didn't close versus Deal Desk wasn't engaged at all. And here's the outcome of those different transactions. So I made reference to, I think, a no touch metric, and that's probably core to what I've been building internally. And that's simply a measure of, when I say no touch, this deal did not have to go through legal approval. It did not have to go through Deal Desk approval versus the deals that are negotiated, redlined, have multiple turns, go through those cross-functional approvals from teams outside of go-to-market. And I'm constantly using, honestly, Ironclad, our own system, to track and tell that story. Here's how much revenue is being transacted without Deal Desk having to be involved versus here's the segment of revenue where we're really heavily engaged. Could be because of pricing, could be because of custom commercial terms and contract structure. But being able to tell that story, I think, has been able to make a big impact in how we shape our processes and policies to drive that metric.
So let's all talk about what kind of signals can help flag a deal that might be at risk, or some kind of forecasting signal that could indicate we're not on track, or actually I think this person's sandbagging.
Vinny, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've primarily ran into a lot within my career were certain users, right? Certain salespeople. Kamala, I think you said something earlier. We're late into the month, and this particular person always just does. They can approve up to 15% themselves. Every deal they do has got 15% discount automatically without even talking to the customer. So if you can start to think of a way to look at those person's deals, compare them to their cohort and or peers that are in the same sort of role, and predict a little bit to your forecast. I always say every time Vinny's going to go through a quote, 15% off, no matter what. And then what I was saying earlier, right? Is there something you can look at from an industry perspective? When I sell to automotive, we have a much more competitive market here where there's always just one competitor who does stuff just as good as we do. Whereas in pharmaceutical, we have nobody else there. We can ask for basically no discount. We always no touch. Oh, everybody accepts what we do. I think a lot of it is thinking about your processes and your data points. Because again, if you're just thinking about like data drives action, right? What can I collect to help me later on to figure this out so that way we get out of the way? Because if I know I'm going to go automotive, we know we got to accept a little bit better terms. Where if I go to the pharmaceutical route, we're golden.
Yeah, in terms of like that middle box around forecasting accuracy, we use contracting data, I think, to try and get a really non-biased view of does a deal or does an order have a realistic shot at closing. And I'll use an example like you can leverage a CRM to pull a very basic report that says, hey, here's all of your opportunities that have a close date this quarter. But as you get closer to end of quarter, maybe you're 48 hours away, we leverage contract data. For example, like, has an order form workflow been launched yet? Has an enterprise services agreement been launched in relation to these deals? I think we've all probably negotiated enough deals on this call to understand that, hey, if you're forecasting a 7-figure deal and it's 48 hours left in the quarter and you don't have a contract generated at that point that's been reviewed by the counterparty, you can understand most likely that deal is most likely going to push, if we're being honest. Another insight that we use is tracking things through Ironclad and the number of turns that we do in a given deal cycle. So we can understand our typical deal goes through this amount of turns and compare that to other open deals and understand, how much of a life cycle or a timetable do we need to set in order to close some of these transactions. Specifically referring to contract data and understanding what your average deal process looks like and what your average time to close is, I think helps to really inform at a forecasting level, hey, it's great that this opportunity is forecasted to close this quarter, but we're missing some really key indicators that would actually point from a contract perspective to this is going to get signed in the next 2 days, the next week, within the quarter.
Yeah, those are great points. And then, Vinny, I like that you mentioned the 15% across the board, because that's a fantastic coaching opportunity to let them know that's the most you can approve. You have no room to move at all. On the opposite spectrum of that, when the job market was really good, the VP of sales would come over to me and be like, okay, who's checked out? Who's job hunting? And we could tell because they weren't generating quotes. Like their activity had drastically altered from their norms. So looking at trending data, number of quotes generated by opportunity, you can really start to get an idea of your attrition risk. So it's not just forecasting. There's a lot of great ways that we can use this information to help give people a heads up, get them re-engaged, or just figure out, do we need to start hiring in that market?
That's an excellent call out for sure, because we've all been there, right? Where you see your peers that are knocking it out of the park, and then all of a sudden, not nosedive, but drastically goes down. Then a month later, adios.
Yeah. You start to spot the patterns, and then speaking up is always a good thing. I think we get a little too gun shy about speaking up because sometimes the sales managers, I would know if my blah, 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 blah. But if you bring it up and you're right a few times, they start proactively coming over to you and being like, oh, okay, what's happening this month? Deal insights. I have a weird perspective on this because I've noticed in a lot of smaller companies, we can get really creative with how we calculate things like MRR and ARR. And as we start to grow larger and have, I don't know, Sarbanes-Oxley audits, we start to get a little more regimented. What are some other deal insights? I know we talked about special terms, why we should layer on segments. Is there anything else we haven't called out that you think is an interesting way to look at the information?
I think from my perspective, at least, I like to understand maybe deal structure more than anything, because certain deal structures are also indicators of deal desk is going to be involved in these things. So maybe it's a deal that ramps over the term of the contract in terms of provisioning and ARR. Maybe it's a cancel and replacement of an existing contract. I think we've really been focused on creating those indicators and data fields within Salesforce and Ironclad so that we have a full view of the spectrum of deals that include, I would say, really specific data points. But it's data points, like I said, that are important to us. I try to avoid getting out of tracking everything and talking about, like our CRO uses the term metrics that matter. So understanding what are the metrics that matter to us and how do we keep those constant? How do we avoid those changing every week, every month, every quarter? And that way we can build a really solid base and a clear picture of the very specific types of deals and the structures that we're seeing, informing pricing strategy, informing approvals and other processes.
Great points. Vinny, anything to add before we move to the next slide?
Yeah, and just like back to that, right? If it's new business versus upsell or cross-sell, just what are they changing licenses from and to, and just having a good collection as to what asset or subscription that they did or do have currently, right? And that just helps just the white space later on. What could we cross-sell to somebody else later, expand them per se?
So we've spoken through these a bit, but maybe we can give some specific examples from we can anonymize them. We don't need to call out specific salespeople, but if we can give some examples of where this came into play, and then maybe, Vinny, I would love for you to layer on the automation approval aspect of this and how we can streamline these situations. So identifying negotiation patterns, Vinny brought up a great one with at the end of the month, so-and-so always does the maximum they can get by default. Other negotiation patterns, Vinny, maybe a specific example with a specific rep pops to mind?
Not specifically, but from a hypothetical perspective, I know at one organization I was at, we did not have a CFO. We would be down to the last couple of days of the month or quarter.
Yeah.
Brett would always say, I have a special CFO discount that I can approve up to 20% right now on the call if you're ready to execute today or tomorrow. I always thought that was funny because we didn't even have somebody in that role, but they were constantly saying, I got this special CFO discount that I can give you today. So I did say that I didn't think of a person, but as I was telling the story, this is totally somebody I worked with for a very long time. And it worked to their advantage pretty frequently to get this over the line at the end.
And kudos to Nick, because I remember so many times when I'd get a temper tantrum on the phone and have to joke with the person, hey, I'm just trying to keep you out of jail because what you're promising these people isn't kosher. You're giving them a pricing opt-out at 60 days without any approval if the product doesn't meet their expectations, and you're not putting like solid guidelines around what those expectations are. Why would they stay here? Are there other examples, Nick, that you can think of?
I can think of one that is very close between both identifying your negotiation patterns as well as driving process and policy enhancement or improvements. I think in the macroeconomic environment that we live in right now, we're keeping a very close eye on payment terms. Our standard payment terms are net 30, and honestly, that's something that is coming up in a lot of deal cycles, especially in specific segments. How do we extend those? How do we shorten them? And understanding what those patterns are. One of the benefits of me reporting into the finance organization is also being able to keep a very close eye on our aging process within our invoices. So working closely with revenue accounting to understand we're doing this many deals with maybe net 30 terms, and we're getting paid in this average anticipated rate versus these customers who are requesting and negotiating extended payment terms, and maybe they're still paying us late. So being able to spot things like invoicing and collection risk in advance, and then being able to drive, I would say, better policy improvements around that. I'll give an example. There's a lot of negotiations that I sit on one side and I hear from the sales rep, this prospect is requesting net 120 payment terms or something ridiculous, but it's because it's their company policy or it's their company standard. And understanding like, okay, that how do we work with them? What else can we offer? What else can we kind of position in order to maybe keep our payment terms in line with our standard and to avoid the back and forth where it's a sales rep kind of being in the middle playing a game of telephone.
Oh, yeah, that's relatable. So before we touch on process and policy improvements, have you guys, just out of curiosity, have you run into negotiations that get stalled a bit because the company you're working with has contracted with a purchasing department, like contracting company? I'm using the wrong term for this, but I'm thinking like vendor.com, where they actually have a team of negotiators on your behalf. If you're a smaller company, you can contract. Have you run into that? Or anyone on the call, if you want to comment? I have.
I personally have not. I don't know if maybe I have, and I just haven't met with the team like personally, but I've not seen that in deal cycles yet.
So one of the things that drives me crazy about process and policy improvements, I think automating approvals, streamlining the deal on the operations side is fantastic. But when you're dealing with, maybe you're at a smaller company and your lawyer is contracted and they work hourly, that can slow things up. Customer experience operations should be applied to accounting, legal, all these places. How have you both worked with, I don't know, legal or other departments to suggest things that could streamline as opposed to having them review every single contract?
From my perspective, Deal Desk is always a team that's going to have a very close partnership with legal. In my past roles, Deal Desk has reported into the legal organization at times. There's a very close partnership, at least here within Ironclad. And I think setting a cadence with that team, especially for myself, I meet with our commercial attorneys once a month, and we look back at all the contracts that we negotiated from the prior month, talk about the trends that we're seeing, to talk about the average deal cycles, what are the reoccurring patterns and the terms that are maybe coming up most frequently, and really trying to iterate on our policies quickly. And every quarter is great. 90 days can be a long time, and a lot can change in that window, where it benefits to have multiple touch points and a lot of collaboration around, okay, if we adjust this, maybe we also look to adjust or change this other area and make sure that everything remains balanced across our legal terms, our commercial terms, given that there's so many stakeholders involved.
Yeah, and I would also try to call out too, if the deal is something our organization has to accept something on their paper, right? So we have to not get all of our master service agreements essentially approved, but we got to do some stuff on their side. And then next thing you know, this thing takes 5, 6, 7 weeks to get through the going back and forth of everything that we need to notify them of. Right.
Yeah, the thing that pops in my head is enterprise deals and red lines. Oh boy, we've all been there.
Yeah, back to your point, if you're paying somebody that's not on staff and they're third party, there goes your cost of sale, right? You continuously are paying some expensive folks that are outside of it. And how can you tell those telltale signs earlier in the deal cycle? I think that it's going to be a per business potentially understanding, but you got to imagine that if you're having some of those discussions early on, can you forecast for them almost?
So speaking of negotiation patterns, trying to tie this together, just work with me. Would love to talk a little bit about refining the deal approval process and how we route that. So we had an interesting conversation where I thought I had a great idea on how to keep it streamlined, but Nick's team rolled that back for various reasons. I've always thought of it as figuring out who should approve what and streamline. If the top person approves it, let's not make all the other people approve it. But Nick had a great point. If they're not also approving it, they're not understanding how frequently this is happening. There's other considerations we want them to make and be involved in. What are the different levers you've pulled in terms of approval routing and thinking through that workflow?
Yeah. On our side, I'll speak specifically to pricing approvals. Initially, my thought is always, let's send out the approvals at one time. So everybody who needs to approve, instead of doing it sequentially, we all receive the approval at the same time, and any sort of cross-functional conversation that needs to happen can occur. And after a couple months of doing that, we found that it was actually creating a little bit of confusion when you have discounts going up to your chief revenue officer or discounts up to your chief financial officer. And so we refactored that process a little bit so that our discounting approvals, for example, are now sequential. And that was very specifically done so that if an approval goes to our chief revenue officer, let's say, he can already see that it's been approved by other sales leaders throughout the process, and that gives the deal a level of credibility. There's comments and insights from other sales leaders by the time that it gets to a certain level, so that he's more informed on maybe the context behind why we're pricing a deal a certain way. And that has actually been shown to allow our overall approvals to happen quicker than if we were just to spray all of the approvals out at one time and create a lot of side conversations and questions around deal structure.
And Nick, I'd be curious, do you find that the folks that are going up the ladder, are they actually putting in detailed enough comments that as it does go to their direct manager over and over again, it's enough to not have to go in and look at the exact deal, where they get enough of it to say, yeah, we should totally approve this because I have enough context?
Yeah, honestly, that was a big concern of mine, but we've built a system logic that kind of mandates it, as well as additional further support. In the spirit of explaining the solution, we use Salesforce CPQ in order to submit a quote for approval. There is a required text field that our AEs and sales reps have to complete, saying, why am I seeking approval for this specific thing? And so mandatory fields that they have to complete in order to even be able to submit the quote, that at least provides the initial approver with a lot of context. That context then makes its way through all of the other kind of following approvals. And then each approver in the steps can add their additional context. Hey, I talked to the rep and we've aligned on this, or hey, we're going to pull this deal back and we're going to adjust it in some way. It's been highly impactful, I think, to one, make the change in the overall structure, but on our side, building that kind of system guardrail where we make it genuinely required has, I think, accelerated a lot of deal cycles, because it's one or two lines of context and speed something up and tell a story in a way where it creates a level of ease and comfort for our approvers as well.
I think sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, it also avoids like a non-needed internal call around something, right? It frees up 30 minutes potentially, or even a freaking hour in unnecessary.
Yeah, and that's super interesting, because I've dealt with a lot of really small process resistant companies where, if we're being honest, the VP of sales was a micromanager and involved in just about every deal anyway. So skipping people made more sense in that situation. I also noticed the level of, I won't say desperation, I'll say willingness to approve discounts changed as the quarter went on, depending on how close or far away from the goal we were and how close or far away from a fundraising round we were. So Vinny, you had a really interesting point in creating some system flexibility around discounting rates. If you could talk about that a little bit.
For sure. A lot of this, depending on what you're using in terms of your quoting process and or tools. My experience with all of our current customers ranges drastically. Some of them can afford a CPQS tool, whereas others are just using Salesforce's standards, products, price books, quote scenario. And with that, when we're thinking through designing aspects of it, how do I have my everyday discount process approval that does happen, lives and breathes inside of a screen flow? However, there are points, right? We are towards the end of the month, the end of the quarter. I need to close some sort of business to produce this up to my board. We're in logo acquisition because we're trying to raise our Series B or C. So just designing sort of something that can look at either custom metadata or something else where you don't have to go in and actually edit the automation itself. You just go in and you modify a record, and toggling that record on or off can use now that max discount. And then if it's not on, it goes back to your standard process that you currently have. So think of it more as like an on-demand sort of ad hoc scenario, and then you can change that frequency of what you want it to be.
And I think I view like Nick's scenario as best case ideal. And we're talking like scrappy startup that
Yeah.
just, yeah.
You got to live, man. You got to get to the next day and you're fighting for it. And I want to be able to afford something that's like a CPQ. I don't have $100,000 to spend on the implementation and then another $150 per user per month. So it adds up pretty quick.
Yeah.
So
Totally. And I have gained all these gray hairs, and I blame many of them on certain deals and sales reps. So it's good. We're living.
that's why I
So
drink a lot
let's,
of bourbon.
yeah. Let's talk about some real world applications here. We haven't gotten into dashboarding for sales leadership and key stakeholders. I would love to talk about a little bit of the details here, but also, in my experience, they don't actually look at the reports very much. So how can we enable them by spoon feeding them the information they need to know beyond just the dashboard? So let's start with the dashboard and then talk about a little bit of leadership enablement.
Yeah, for sure. From my perspective, I think I have a similar experience when it comes to dashboards. I think people tend to underestimate, like sales leaders are getting pulled in 100 different directions, depending on what time it is in the quarter, what time is it month end, how is the team performing. Going back to the theme of metrics that matter, this is where I really engage our sales leaders to say, what are the things that you care about and what will make you successful, so that if we're aligned on those things, I can produce those insights for you. And having to sell using the dashboards, like that entire process kind of dissipates, because we've already done the hard work early on of understanding, here's what maybe I specifically care about, or here's what maybe our CRO cares about. Understanding at each level and part of the organization, and getting that buy-in on what the outcome is going to be, I think drastically removes the possibility of, hey, I created this really cool dashboard. It gives me all these great insights. I'm throw it over the fence to you as a sales leader, and maybe they're like, okay, this is like not what I was looking for, or it doesn't tell me the story that I'm trying to solve for the problems today or this week. That early buy-in, I think, is really critical. And then also, we're using the example of sales leadership, but I just think the general concept of knowing your audience is critical. We leverage our contract data, obviously, for our sales side motion and for our sales leadership team, but our revenue accounting leadership has different core tenets and tasks and goals that they're trying to achieve that are very different. So it's not a one size fits all, unfortunately. Very rarely is there a universal dashboard that every team is going to log into and get the same amount of value of. But being able to leverage solutions to create tailored experiences and data for each specific team has had really significant impacts for us.
Yeah, one of my favorite spins on a common saying is, as long as it gets in Salesforce, I don't care where it happened. So thinking through, maybe we have some sales managers that are like, I don't really care about the aggregate numbers. I just want to know when there's a problem with the deal. Maybe they work in Slack. Maybe we integrate things and flag specific deals when there's an issue, just to get them participating and proactive as opposed to reactive. Vinny, do you have some examples of where you've used this logic, meet them where they're at?
Yeah, and to your point, meet them where they're at. If I primarily always work out of email, we want to send them email alerts. Or if they work out of Slack or Teams, you want to find a solution that can produce that sort of thing. Or if they just strictly work out of Gong forecasting using Gong deals or something like that, make sure that you have boards set up that they can find that. But to that point, it's where they're comfortable and where they're going to naturally go in the day. Because to Nick's thing, it's cool. I created this universal dashboard. Cool. I'm not logging into Salesforce. I want to go to Slack and I want to add Slack. What's up with this deal? Tell me. And there's rules like Rattle or Momentum and stuff like out there that work really awesome from like a machine learning perspective that can sum this up and say, this is where this is at, and you're potentially at risk.
So I think we've covered guardrails and governance pretty well. Let me know, do either of you want to touch on that a little bit more? Sweet. So deal volume and types by differentiating variables. We have touched on this too. We've talked about getting really detailed on the individual level, the segment level. Are there an industry? Are there other interesting use cases that we can pull in here? Mine aren't really as relevant because I was running Deal Desk back in the day when we were still selling hardware and software, but sometimes product lines.
What comes to mind for me is a specifically impactful insight that we've given sales leaders is understanding the types of contracts that their team is working on. So it's not always an order form. It's not always an enterprise service agreement. Sometimes it's a non-disclosure agreement early in the sales process. Sometimes it's a statement of work that carries professional services revenue with it. So understanding how the team is goaled from an attainment perspective, what are the metrics that they're measured on? We leverage things like contract type, metadata showing a sales leader, hey, here's all of the contracts that your team is currently working on. Here are the types of contracts that they are. And I think a sales leader is able to understand a lot through that lens of where's my team spending effort? Where are we dedicating time on contract review cycles and redlining and negotiations? And is it in the right place? Sometimes you'll see a very low dollar contract with a very high rate of red lines and turns. Sometimes you'll see that the biggest deals sometimes take 2 days. Being able to illustrate that to a sales leader through the lens of, hey, here are the types of contracts and the volume of contracts that your team is working on, I think shows one, a lot of where the activity sits, but really where maybe more than anything, and most importantly, where the productivity of the team is sitting.
That was such a perfect illustration too, of why so many of us try to work mid-market up, because there are startups that just, I'm like, I don't know what you all are thinking, that you're special enough to get this kind of pricing at this entry-level product. What is happening? That's such a great example. Vinny, do you have anything to add there?
No, I think Nick summed it up perfectly there.
Yeah.
You know, I think that it's amazing. And I want to be more in the room where you're getting huge deals in 2 days, man, because I need to come work for you then.
All right. So to sum it up, I think we talked about how contract data can help us many ways, including insights on how we should update terms and conditions, streamline processes that are repeated over and over, and just acknowledging that they're repeated over and over so we can skip over that part. Knowing your stakeholders and which metrics apply to them. Nick, I thought you touched on that brilliantly when you were talking about accounting versus sales management versus the actual sales end user, and then continually review contract data to identify process issues, which, you know, they're all so interconnected. It's hard to talk about them separately. Vinny, you mentioned some resources when it comes to process automation and talking through Lightning. Would you like to touch on those before we wrap up?
Not necessarily. I just had this in the background in case it popped up in some sort of QA thing. Salesforce has got a ginormous level of communities that are out there. One that I belong to is RevOps Co-op. Another one's Wizard of Ops. I mean, there's a ton of people out there. You can go out and ask questions. This is probably the only community on the internet that people are not assholes to one another, where they will actually go in and try to help you and go in and even jump on a screen share and say, I'm stuck on this, help me walk through it. And I've been in there plenty of times on both sides of the house. So take advantage of these sort of communities. They're worthwhile. There's a ton of stuff that can just help you as somebody trying to get yourself into this sort of line of work or this career, because we've all done it. And hopefully you're not the first one to ever experience this pain.
Yeah, Vinny, and I love hearing another person who's been in it a long time and just wants to pay it forward, because back when I was starting, Google was the resource.
Google or YouTube videos. You know how many YouTube videos I watched? And I'm 15 years in. I still don't have one single Salesforce admin certification. I don't know if that's good or bad, but I've also talked to some folks who got 15, and I think it's years behind the keyboard are a little bit more in my eyes of an experience that I'd prefer. But like I said, we all got our battle scars. We're all out here. We're all willing to help and reach out to this community. It's fantastic to get the help from them.
Yeah, I've vetted people with certifications who get offended at certain questions. And I would like to remind people that it's because you can get a certification and not have the depth of understanding that what people ask for and what they actually want are usually completely different things. And we need the skills to wade through all of that and come out on the other side. Not that certifications aren't useful, but I would tend to agree with you on that one.
You got to learn how to ask the same question why 7 times.
Yeah.
Because if somebody can't answer that 7 times, it's probably not a process or a need for it.
And speaking of asking why 7 times, Nick, any final thoughts as it to contracting deal desk?
No, not particularly. I just think I've been extremely fortunate, being a part of this space now for 7, 8 years. I think maybe the most refreshing thing about it is there's always a different set of challenges, and getting to pick and choose the challenges that we want to solve and how we want to solve them, I think, is what makes the role and really makes RevOps in general like a really compelling opportunity.
Yeah, the only constant is change. Love it. Love it. Thank you both for sharing all of your knowledge. I really appreciate you both. And thank you to all the attendees. Please have a wonderful day and do take the survey on the way out so we can always learn how to improve. Enjoy your day, folks.
Thank you.